In the years 1943 and 1944, the battle began to move men in ways no map could soften. Along the coasts of North Africa and the ports of Britain, German soldiers, some captured in collapsed desert offensives, others taken after the slow, grinding retreats, were assembled for a journey that did not point east toward home, but west toward something unknown. They were marched in columns to the docks, counted, searched, and loaded onto ships under armed guard, not as victors parading through conquered capitals, but as cargo inventory in a battle that had learned to measure human bodies by the thousand. Most expected the usual logic of defeat: harsh captivity, interrogation, a propaganda stage where men would be photographed, shamed, and reduced to evidence. The older ones remembered stories from the last battle. The younger had been raised on promises that enemies were monsters. And there, between the salt air and the clatter of chains, the idea took hold that whatever waited across the ocean would be built on humiliation. A prisoner, after all, was not simply a soldier without a rifle. He was a symbol of failure. Symbols were treated accordingly. The Atlantic crossing did not feel like imprisonment. It felt like exile. Days merged into a cold, metallic rhythm, the creak of hull plates, the dull throb of engines, the taste of rust in the air. Somewhere above, an armed watch stood under canvas. Somewhere below, men lay shoulder to shoulder, listening to the sea slap the steel, as if it were trying to speak through it. The battle they had known: orders, salutes, front lines, was replaced by something quieter and more frightening: time. Long hours in which the mind returned to what it had avoided thinking about: home, surrender, and the unanswered question of what comes after obedience collapses. Rumors did what rumors always do in confined spaces: they became a second reality. Some said Americans treated prisoners like showpieces. Others said they starved them. Still others, spoken in lowered voices, claimed the opposite, that the Americans were soft, that captivity there would be comfortable, and that comfort itself was a trap. No rumor could be proven. But all of them fed the same thing: low morale, and expectations even lower. The United States remained an abstraction, an industrial name on enemy briefings, a distant skyline in newsreels, a power described more than understood. Then the ship slowed, the air changed. Land appeared not like a battlefield, but like a shoreline that did not seem to care who had won. And when they arrived, what met them first was not the spectacle they feared, only the first quiet surprise, and the unsettling sense that the rules here might be different. The first American hours did not arrive with speeches or banners. They arrived with movement, quiet, organized, unquestioned. The prisoners were transferred from ship to rail, herded into waiting cars, and sent inland as if the continent itself had been expecting them. The train pulled away from the coast and began to cut through a landscape that felt too wide to be real. Forest gave way to towns, towns to open fields, and the horizon kept retreating, always just beyond reach. For men raised on Europe's tight borders and familiar distances, the scale alone was disorienting. It was not merely travel, it was a kind of dilution, an awareness that they were being carried into a country vast enough to absorb them. Then the rail yards appeared, and the idea of America turned into steel. Track after track unfolded: switches, signals, warehouses, cranes, an industrial language spoken with total fluency. The yards stretched beyond the line of sight, and even that felt like only a fragment of something far larger. Back in Europe, daily life had narrowed into schedules and shortages. Here, everything widened into production. The men leaned toward the narrow windows, watching locomotives slide past with a weight and steadiness that suggested no shortage of fuel, no shortage of parts, no shortage of momentum. Factories rose like cities within cities. Their windows glowed through the evening and into the night, not the careful muted light of blackout curtains, but full illumination, constant and unapologetic. Machinery ran as if it had never heard of interruption. Work continued after dark, and that detail struck deeper than the towering smokestacks. In Europe, night had become a time of uncertainty. Here, night belonged to output. Freight cars moved with mechanical precision, linked and unlinked, routed and rerouted, in a choreography indifferent to human concern. It wasn't simply that America had trains. It was that the trains behaved like extensions of a system that never paused. Every coupling, every whistle, Every measured stop hinted at a confidence built directly into the infrastructure itself, an assurance that immense weight could be carried without breaking stride. Even the personnel reflected that confidence. They were attentive, but unhurried. Their posture lacked urgency or strain. They observed quietly, with the calm of people who trusted the system around them to remain steady. That calm carried its own message. Everything here was already under control. Inside the cars, the men exchanged uneasy glances. The stories they had carried across the ocean of disorder, fragility, collapse, began to feel poorly sourced. Something fundamental did not align with what they had expected. And as the train moved deeper inland, past more lights that did not dim and more factories that did not sleep, a new question settled among them. If this was what America looked like from a distance, what would it look like up close? The facility did not announce itself with hardship. It announced itself with routine. Vehicles arrived on schedule. Crates were stacked with care. Kitchens operated with ingredients that did not appear improvised. For men accustomed to scarcity, the early days carried a quiet contradiction. Meals were consistent, equipment was present, and the basic mechanics of daily life, blankets, tools, soap, paper appeared not as rare prizes, but as standard issue. They had assumed restriction would mean deprivation. Instead, it felt like stepping into a system that simply functioned. They noticed it first in small details, because details are how the mind protects itself from larger conclusions. Bread that held together, coffee that smelled like coffee, a coat that hadn't been repaired again and again. Not luxury, nothing extravagant, but steadiness. And in a global crisis, steadiness was a form of strength. The men began to look at one another differently, as if the environment itself was quietly asking them to reconsider what real power looked like. Beyond the perimeter, motion never seemed to stop. Trains passed in the distance on relentless schedules, their whistles marking time. Trucks moved along roads untouched by damage. Somewhere beyond the trees and towers, heavy machinery worked with patient consistency, metal meeting metal, day following day, as if fatigue had been engineered out of the landscape. In Europe, movement carried risk. Here, movement was ordinary. The logistics of an entire continent behaved like a machine designed to continue, uninterrupted. What unsettled them most was not what America had built, but what it had not lost. Civilian life continued without the visible signature of war damage. There were no collapsed streets, no burned-out blocks, no shattered church spires standing like accusations. The towns they glimpsed on work details, through passing truck beds, from the edges of the camp, looked intact, almost indifferent. People walked into stores, cars moved, lights came on at night. The war, which had reached into every kitchen and every bedroom back home, seemed here to be kept at a distance, translated into production figures rather than rubble. So the prisoners began to count factories instead of fences. It became a habit, then a fixation, another smokestack, another warehouse, another cluster of buildings humming at all hours. And with each count came the same silent arithmetic. If this is what lies within reach of a single camp, what lies beyond it? The scale did not merely defy explanation, it resisted imagination. At first, the shock had been physical, the size of the rail yards, the brightness of the factories at night. Now, it turned inward. Because if America could feed its captives with consistency while manufacturing without pause, then the war was not only being fought on battlefields, it was being decided in places the prisoners could not see behind factory doors, on schedules, on assembly lines, and the realization settled like cold metal. They had sailed not into a prison, but into the engine room of the enemy. Long before the train carried them across the American interior, many of these men had already crossed an ocean in their minds. It was built from newsreels, speeches, and classroom certainty, an image of the enemy assembled deliberately, frame by frame. Nazi propaganda did not merely describe America, it simplified it into a moral lesson. The United States was presented as soft, decadent, distracted by comfort and profit. A nation of jazz, cigarettes, and careless laughter, too mixed, too indulgent, too uncommitted to endure a serious war. The message was not subtle. It was meant to reassure. It was meant to make Germany's struggle feel like destiny. Even when the Reich acknowledged American industry, it did so with a kind of contempt. Claims about output aircraft rolling off lines, ships launched in weeks were dismissed as exaggeration, the way distant numbers always are when they threaten a story. It was easier to believe that enemy reports were inflated, than to accept that an ocean away, a different kind of power was being assembled. For soldiers at the front, the immediate world was mud, ammunition, and the next order. Abstract factories meant little compared to the hard fact of a well-trained platoon, and so the men learned to wave away the idea that production could outvote tactics. They believed efficiency favored discipline, not scale. In German military culture, discipline was not only a virtue, it was a proof of superiority. The idea that a society could be loose in manner yet precise in output seemed contradictory. They had been taught that machines require order, and order requires a certain kind of people. America, in their imagination, lacked that spine. It was a marketplace, not a barracks. It could grow rich, perhaps, but could it sustain sacrifice? Could it ration, endure losses, and remain united? The propaganda answered those questions in advance. No. There was also a strategic C in capacity. It was not the same thing. There were reasons the misjudgment felt plausible. America's civilian industry in the 1930 seconds was famous for cars, refrigerators, radios, objects of comfort, not war. In Berlin and at field headquarters, it was easy to imagine that a society built on consumer choice would be slow to adapt to military necessity. Factories designed for chrome trim and household appliances seemed an odd foundation for tanks and bombers. The assumption followed naturally. Converting that world into a war machine would take time, and time was something Germany believed it could deny. Democracy itself was treated as a technical weakness. Dictatorship, in theory, can command. Democracy must persuade. The Reich looked at American politics, elections, debates, compromises, and saw delay. In a crisis, they assumed, such a system would grind and argue while disciplined states acted. German planners had been trained to admire decisiveness, to distrust pluralism, to equate unity with obedience. The possibility that a democratic society might produce coordination without coercion was not taken seriously. It did not fit the ideological model, and ideologies are famously resistant to inconvenient evidence. Pre-war isolationism deepened the illusion. For years, American reluctance to enter another European war was interpreted as softness, an inward-looking complacency. In Germany's propaganda lens, the United States was a place of money without will. Even after Lend-Lease began feeding Allied arsenals, even after American shipyards expanded and production numbers rose, it was possible if one wished to believe this comfort in expecting short wars. Germany's early victories had trained the mind to believe in compression, swift campaigns, decisive encirclements, the quick collapse of opponents who were unprepared. Even setbacks could be framed as temporary, soon to be corrected by a new weapon, a new plan, a final push. A prolonged production contest year after year, ship after ship, engine after engine, was not the war the average soldier had been promised. It was not even the war the Reich pride wanted to imagine. Long wars belong to economies. They belong to patience. They belong to the side that can replace what is lost without breaking its rhythm. And America's diversity, so central to its reality, was presented as weakness. Different accents, different religions, different faces. These were described not as a reservoir, but as a fracture line. The Reich preached purity as cohesion. From that point of view, a plural nation could only be fragile, held together by convenience rather than conviction. In barracks and field kitchens, the joke came easily. The Americans would argue, the Americans would tire, the Americans would go home. So these assumptions traveled with the men into captivity like hidden luggage. They shaped how the prisoners interpreted every sight, every gesture. A polite guard could be misread as naive. An intact town could be dismissed as distance from the front, not proof of strength. Even the abundance they encountered in camp could be rationalized as a temporary indulgence, something that could not last once the war tightened its grip. But reality does not argue. It accumulates. It stands in rail yards that stretch beyond the horizon and in factories that burn with light through the night. It hums in supply chains that deliver the ordinary without strain. And little by little, without a single dramatic moment, the beliefs the prisoners had carried so confidently began to dismantle themselves piece by piece, like a machine being taken apart in silence. Because the longer they watched America at work, the harder it became to hold on to the idea that this was a nation that could be outlasted. And somewhere beyond the fences, The real contest, discipline versus scale, doctrine versus output, was already approaching its verdict. Germany did not enter the war believing it could manufacture infinity. It entered believing it could manufacture advantage. Long before the first prisoner stepped onto an American platform, the Reich's strategic confidence had been built on a particular kind of industrial faith, one that prized precision engineering, tight tolerances, and the belief that quality could compensate for limits. German machines were expected to be smarter than their numbers. A few excellent tools, in the right hands, at the right moment. This was the industrial echo of the Blitzkrieg itself. In factories and design bureaus, that philosophy produced real achievements. German optics, metallurgy, and mechanical craftsmanship were admired even by enemies. Tanks and aircraft were refined, improved, recalibrated models, evolving rapidly as the war demanded new answers. But refinement carries a cost. Precision requires time, skilled hands, and stable supply. The more complex a weapon became, the more it depended on specialists who could not be trained in a week and replaced in a month. Skilled labor was not just valuable, it was irreplaceable. And in a war that devoured men, irreplaceability is a quiet vulnerability. The German industrial mind, shaped by scarcity and constraint, tended to value quality over quantity because quantity was never guaranteed. Germany did not possess the same access to raw materials as its rivals. It could not draw endlessly from oil fields and iron reserves, without interruption, without conquest, without risk. The economy was a careful balance of imports, substitutes, forced labor, and captured resources, an elaborate structure that could function, but not indefinitely under pressure. Long wars strain limited resources not only in the obvious way, fuel, rubber, aluminum, but in the less visible one, the gradual erosion of resilience. When every component is precious, loss becomes cumulative. Strategy grew from this soil. The Reich's early war planning leaned heavily on decisive campaigns, quick victories that would secure territory, resources, and political collapse before enemies could mobilize fully. In that logic, a war of years was not a plan, it was a warning. A prolonged contest meant the opponent's reserves would come online, and Germany's constraints would become a cage. The battlefield, therefore, had to deliver closure. Encirclements, breakthroughs, the rapid disintegration of resistance, these were not only operational preferences, they were economic necessities. But necessity can turn into arrogance when it is mistaken for universal truth. Sustained attrition, the slow, grinding exchange in which factories matter as much as generals, was consistently underestimated. Even when the war began to reveal its true appetite, there remained a belief that German skill could bend reality back into shape. A new tank, a new aircraft, a new rocket, a new doctrine. Innovation was treated like a lever that could lift the burden of numbers. And sometimes it did briefly, locally, spectacularly. Yet innovation cannot be used up like ammunition. It depends on stability, on supply chains, on a workforce that can keep returning to the same bench, day after day, without being bombed out of existence. This is why the American landscape unsettled the prisoners so profoundly. They were not merely seeing an enemy that had more, they were seeing a different philosophy of war made visible. America's strength was not crafted into a single, flawless mechanism. It was poured into systems, into repetition, standardization, replaceability. Where Germany's pride lay in the irreplaceable specialist, America's power lay in the replaceable part. It was a form of strength that did not require brilliance at every stage, only consistency. And that was the shock. Germany had built its strategy on the belief that wars could be decided before such a system mattered. An industrial comparison was never expected firsthand, not from inside the enemy's engine room, where quantity was not a crude substitute for quality, but a force capable of rewriting the meaning of victory. Because if the war became a contest of endurance rather than decision, then the prisoners were beginning to understand they were watching the wrong kind of clock, and it was already counting down towards something Germany could not easily outbuild. To understand the shock that settled over the prisoners in these camps, it helps to understand the error that preceded it. Germany did not simply misread America's strength, it misread the nature of American change. German intelligence and planning circles had long underestimated the speed with which the United States could mobilize. They saw a country separated by oceans, protected by distance, and before 1941 publicly hesitant to commit itself to Europe's catastrophe. That hesitation was mistaken for as temporary, inflated, or politically fragile. Distance made denial easy. An ocean is not only a barrier to armies, it is a barrier to understanding. Cultural unfamiliarity did the rest. Many German soldiers had never met an American, had never studied the country beyond caricature. Hollywood images and propaganda sketches filled the gap. Loudness mistaken for disorder, informality mistaken for lack of seriousness, diversity mistaken for disunity. When you do not understand the language of another society, you tend to interpret it through your own prejudices. Contempt is often nothing more than unfamiliarity hardened into certainty. But then the prisoners arrived and began to witness consequences rather than theories. They saw that civilian industry was not slow to adapt, it was built for adaptation. Assembly lines designed for automobiles could be retooled for engines and airframes because the underlying logic was the same. Standardization, interchangeable parts, relentless throughput. The American genius was not a single invention. It was an organizational habit. A factory that could produce thousands of identical machines for peacetime consumers could, with the right plans and contracts, produce thousands of identical machines for war. The switch did not require a new culture, it required a new purpose. They also saw that democracy, when finally committed, could compress disagreement into action with startling force. Debate had not prevented mobilization, it had delayed the moment of decision. Once that moment arrived, the scale of coordination was immense. Industry, rail, agriculture, finance, and labor pulled into the same direction, not by fear alone, but by a broad acceptance that the war had become unavoidable. The prisoners were watching a society that had moved from hesitation to momentum, and momentum is difficult to stop once it becomes systemic. In the camps, this was not a lesson taught in lectures. It was learned through observation, through steady food deliveries, through newspapers glimpsed on guard desks, through the endless movement of freight, through the knowledge that factories nearby were producing for fronts thousands of miles away. The prisoners could no longer pretend that American production was a rumor. They were living inside the evidence. Arrogance does not always collapse in dramatic fashion. Sometimes it collapses quietly, like a bridge whose supports have been cut one by one. A man looks out at a rail yard too large to count. He remembers what he was told. He realizes, slowly, that the story was built to comfort him, not to prepare him, and in that realization, something shifts, not his loyalty, perhaps, but his certainty. Because if America had been misjudged this badly, then what else? Had been misjudged? What other assumptions about strategy, about victory, about the enemy's limits were already failing on the far side of the ocean? And as the prisoners adjusted to captivity, a deeper unease began to form. Not fear of punishment, but the dawning sense that the war's outcome might have been decided by miscalculation long before the first shot was fired in their particular battle. Captivity in America was not only confinement. For many German prisoners, it became an education conducted in silence. The wire kept them in, but work details carried them close enough to glimpse the machinery that sustained a continent at war. Assigned to fields, repair yards, warehouses, sawmills, canneries, and rail sidings, they found themselves moving through the outer corridors of an enormous system, touching it without ever controlling it. And in those ordinary tasks, something extraordinary was revealed. Not cruelty, not spectacle, but logistics so stable it felt almost impersonal. The first lesson was food. It arrived with a regularity that did not depend on luck. Trucks came in predictable patterns. Crates were labeled, counted, stacked, and rotated as though hunger itself had been engineered out of the equation. The prisoners, many of whom had seen German supply lines fray under bombing and fuel shortages, could not ignore what their eyes were telling them. America's food supply chains operated without interruption not only for soldiers overseas and civilians at home, but even for the men it held behind fences. The moral meaning of that fact was difficult to name. It was not kindness in a sentimental sense. It was capacity. A nation that can feed its enemies consistently is declaring, without words, that it is not fighting at the edge of its resources. From food, the mind naturally moved to transport. The rail system was everywhere, and it behaved like a clock. Trains arrived and departed with schedules that seemed less like suggestions and more like law. Switches clicked, signals changed, cars were sorted into new lines with practice speed. The prisoners watched long consists of freight roll through junctions, coal, steel, grain, lumber, each car an anonymous part of a larger sentence being written across the continent. In Germany, the railways were lifelines, but also targets, vulnerable to disruption and increasingly strained. Here, the rails seemed to belong to a country that had built redundancy into distance and discipline into motion. What struck the prisoners most was not simply that America had more, it was how little drama was required to move that more from one place to another. There was no frantic improvisation visible, no constant emergency posture. The system ran with the calm of something designed to run. And that calm began to feel like the most unsettling weapon of all. Then came the deeper difference, the way America built things. German industry had often been celebrated for craftsmanship, skilled hands shaping complex components, master machinists making fine adjustments, production that depended on expertise concentrated in individuals. America, by contrast, appeared to treat skill differently. Here, standardization replaced artisanal production wherever possible. Parts were made to fit any matching part, not a single tailored assembly. Tools and gauges enforced uniformity. Training could be distributed. Tasks could be divided into repeatable actions. The prisoners began to understand that American efficiency did not come from each worker being a master. It came from the process being masterful. This was not an insult to American workers. It was a revelation about the nature of industrial power. When output is measured hourly, not annually, war becomes a problem of tempo. A tank lost is not only a tragedy, it is a number to be replaced. An aircraft shot down is not only a mission failure, it is a slot on a production line. In such a system, the individual machine matters less than the flow that produces machines endlessly. For prisoners raised to believe that scale produced clumsiness, this was hard to reconcile. They had been taught that mass production meant mediocrity, that quantity required sacrifice of quality, that only discipline and expertise could create superiority. But the evidence around them suggested another equation. Standardization could create reliability. Reliability could create speed. And speed, multiplied across thousands of lines, could create a kind of quality all its own. Not the elegance of a finely crafted mechanism, but the brutal dependability of a system that keeps delivering replacements. They struggled with what this implied, because if innovation was supposed to look like genius new prototypes, secret weapons, sudden leaps, America's innovation looked different. It revealed itself through repetition. A process improved 1% here, another percent there, a small adjustment to tooling, a change in materials, a refinement in scheduling. The miracle was not the singular breakthrough. The miracle was the accumulation of minor improvements that, over months, became overwhelming. And the prisoners, standing near a loading dock or watching a train of standardized freight roll past, began to see that this was not merely production, it was strategy made physical. America did not need every weapon to be perfect. It needed the next one to be ready. It needed the line to keep moving. It needed time to become an ally rather than an enemy. In that recognition, the camp fence seemed to shift in meaning. It was still a barrier, still a reminder of defeat. But beyond it, the prisoners were watching a machine that did not require their belief to operate and did not require their fear to intimidate. Because the more they saw of the system's calm precision, the more a disturbing possibility took shape. Perhaps the war was not being won by brilliance alone, or even by courage, but by a kind of organized repetition so relentless that it could grind down any advantage Germany still believed it possessed. And if that was true, then somewhere deeper inside this war machine, far beyond the work details and rail sidings, there were numbers being calculated that no battlefield heroism could easily overcome. From the edge of the American interior, industry did not look like a collection of buildings. It looked like a geography. Aircraft plants were not tucked into single factory blocks the way they might be in Europe. They stretched across entire districts, hangar-sized structures, long rows of windows, rail spurs feeding directly into loading bays, water towers and smokestacks marking the skyline like fixed stars. A man could stand in one place and still fail to see the end of it. For prisoners accustomed to thinking in battalion fronts and city limits, these complexes suggested a different kind of front line, one built not of trenches, but of roofs and steel. Inside, the assembly lines moved with a steady indifference to awe. The work was not romantic, not dramatic. It was repetition, disciplined by engineering. Aircraft bombers in particular were produced at rates that sounded like propaganda until they were witnessed, even at a distance. Fuselages advanced in measured increments. Wings were fitted. Wiring harnesses were threaded and secured. Rivet guns sounded in constant rhythm, like rain on metal. What emerged was not a single masterpiece but a sequence, one aircraft becoming the shadow of the next, each nearly identical, each the product of a method that had been optimized to keep moving. For German prisoners, the staggering thing was not merely how many aircraft were being built. It was how unexceptional the process looked. The war, which had demanded heroism and improvisation at the front, appeared here as management, clipboards, time cards, tool stations, standard procedures. It was a reminder that modern conflict is not only decided by those who fight, but by those who make fighting possible, hour after hour, without needing to be inspired by the battlefield. And the workforce itself shattered another set of assumptions. These factories were not filled exclusively with young men of military age. They were filled with women in coveralls, hair tied back under scarves, moving between stations with practice speed. They were filled with older workers, retirees drawn back into service by paychecks and patriotism, hands steady with experience. They were filled with migrants from rural towns and distant states, drawn into industrial centers by the gravity of wages and the promise of belonging to something enormous. America, which propaganda had framed as distracted and divided, was visibly mobilizing every category of its society. Training was rapid, and roles were narrowly defined. A worker did not need to know how to build an entire aircraft. They needed to know their task, one set of rivets, one wiring sequence, one inspection procedure, and they needed to do it the same way, again and again, until the body learned it better than the mind. The genius of the system was that mastery could be distributed. Complexity was broken into manageable units, and the line itself ensured that each unit arrived at the right moment with the right parts. This was not craftsmanship in the old sense. It was orchestration. Errors, inevitably, occurred. In any mass system they must. But here, mistakes did not collapse the whole. They were absorbed by volume. A flawed component could be replaced because there were more components. A delay could be corrected because there were parallel lines, backup shifts, alternate suppliers. Even imperfection had been accounted for. The prisoners had been taught to respect the fragile excellence of the finely engineered machine. Now they were watching a different kind of excellence, resilience designed into repetition. It was in this environment that German POWs began, almost involuntarily, to calculate outcomes. Men who had once counted rounds and rations now counted hangars, shifts, rail cars, the steady procession of finished airframes. They did the arithmetic in silence, because to speak it aloud was to admit what it implied. If an enemy can produce bombers like this, if the rhythm does not break, if the lights do not dim, then the sky itself becomes a pipeline, delivering destruction on schedule. The war's trajectory began to feel less like a contest of genius, and more like a curve shaped by industrial gravity. Courage still mattered, tactics still mattered, but the prisoners could sense the narrowing of possibilities. A nation that could replace aircraft faster than they could be destroyed was not merely fighting battles, it was underwriting the future. And as the factories continued to glow through the night shift after shift, line after line, the prisoners felt an uncomfortable certainty growing beneath their thoughts. If this was what America could build while the war was still raging, what would it build when it decided to end it? In the camps, numbers traveled the way rumors had traveled on the ships, quietly, persistently, finding their way from one man to the next. They appeared in scraps of conversation, overheard on work details, in newspapers left on benches, in offhand remarks by guards who did not realize what those figures meant to men who had grown up inside scarcity. At first, the prisoners treated the numbers as they had been trained to treat Allied claims, with suspicion. But the longer they watched the surrounding machinery of America, the harder it became to dismiss what matched, what they could see. Production figures began to circulate with a strange intimacy, as if the war had been reduced to an equation that could be whispered between bunks. Monthly outputs, aircraft, trucks, ships, were spoken of in terms that felt unreal. Not because the prisoners were ignorant of industry, but because they understood industry too well to believe such scale was possible without collapse. And yet, in the American interior, collapse was not visible. The rail yards still filled. The factory lights still burned. The roads still carried convoys. The numbers began to feel less like boasting and more like a description of the weather, a constant condition. For some prisoners, the most destabilizing comparison was the simplest one. Monthly outputs that exceeded what Germany could manage in a year, figures so lopsided they sounded like an insult. They did not need exact tables to grasp the pattern. If one side is building in weeks, what the other struggles to build in seasons, then time becomes asymmetric. Every delay, every shortage, every destroyed plant on the German side suddenly mattered more. On the American side, loss could be treated as temporary. On the German side, loss was cumulative. Fuel, steel, and food appeared inexhaustible not in the sense that America possessed infinite supplies, but in the sense that scarcity did not intrude into daily visibility. The prisoners had lived through rationing that reshaped conversation, through fuel shortages that stalled operations, through improvisations that revealed a system straining to feed both armies and civilians. Here, the basic inputs of war seemed to flow without drama. Freight cars of coal and steel moved like rivers. Grain silos stood full. Trucks came and went as if gasoline were simply part of the air. This was not comfort. It was a strategic condition. Even the guards spoke differently. Not with cruelty, but with a casual confidence that carried its own weight. Replacement was mentioned the way a mechanic mentions spare parts. If a ship is lost, another is already underway. If an aircraft fails to return, more will fly tomorrow. The prisoners heard this tone and understood it at once. The enemy's psychology was being shaped by abundance. Losses no longer felt decisive because they were no longer final. They were interruptions, not conclusions. And that changed how captivity felt from the inside. Hope did not disappear in a single moment. It drained slowly, the way warmth drains from a room when the fire goes out. Some prisoners still clung to faith in new weapons, in political fractures, in a miracle that might still rescue Germany from the arithmetic. But for many, morale shifted toward acceptance, not of defeat as an emotional surrender, but of defeat as a logical outcome. The war began to look less like a drama of battles, and more like a contest already reframed by capacity. Industrial power, seen up close, does something subtle to the human mind. It makes courage feel smaller, not meaningless, but bounded. It makes strategy feel less like genius and more like logistics. It turns victory into a question of whether a nation can continue producing tomorrow what it produced today. And as the numbers continued to circulate quietly, relentlessly, the prisoners were left with a new kind of fear. Not fear of punishment, but fear that the future had already been manufactured, somewhere beyond the fences, in places that never slept. Understanding rarely arrives as a single revelation. More often, it gathers like weather, small changes in pressure, subtle shifts in light, until one day the air feels different and you realize a season has changed. For the European observers, that shift came when the figures they quietly discussed began to align with the reports circulating through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and word of mouth. What had once felt distant and abstract now revealed a pattern. And once seen, the pattern was difficult to ignore. They began connecting large-scale output to events unfolding across maps and timelines. What once appeared sporadic now felt sustained cycles that repeated because they could be supported. Reports of setbacks no longer carried the reassurance they once had, because the observers had seen the scale behind the numbers. They had watched continuous assembly. They had noticed facilities lit deep into the night. They had heard staff speak of replacement and continuation as ordinary expectations. When something was lost elsewhere, it did not feel decisive if another was already being assembled, already tested, already prepared to move. Loss, they realized, had been absorbed into schedule. That awareness made large movements across regions feel less mysterious and more methodical. Advances across difficult terrain, sustained pressure in multiple directions, these were not sudden bursts of daring. They were expressions of capacity. Behind every movement was supply. Behind every push was fuel, material, coordination, and planning that did not falter. To men who had witnessed progress stall simply because essentials ran out, this momentum began to feel less like chance and more like structure. The contrast sharpened their thinking. Reports of shortages elsewhere, of disrupted facilities, constrained resources, shrinking capacity no longer sounded temporary. They sounded structural. The observers recognized the pattern immediately. Scarcity narrows options. Improvisation becomes permanent. Each loss compounds because there is no reserve to soften it. Scarcity does not need to overwhelm quickly, it only needs to persist. At some point, continuation began to feel mathematically unsustainable. Not emotionally impossible, people can hold hope for a long time, but logically strained. The observers did not need full datasets or forecasts. They had seen enough to understand direction. When one system can replace losses faster than another can absorb them, the outcome shifts from belief to calculation. And calculation does not respond to rhetoric. That was when conversations changed. In the evenings, after daily routines had quieted and the noise of activity faded, discussions moved away from tactics and toward meaning. Men who once argued about decisions and leadership began asking different questions about what they had been taught, what they had accepted, and how belief interacts with evidence. Some spoke of inevitability, others spoke of misjudgment, a few spoke of responsibility, each in their own language. What had once felt like a contest of systems began to feel like a test of human judgment. That was the turning point, not a dramatic announcement, not a visible signal, but an internal shift, a recognition that outcomes were being shaped by forces larger than individual choices. Hope could still exist. Reversals could still be imagined. But beneath that surface, the shape of events had already changed. Because, once you begin to understand the machinery behind outcomes, it becomes impossible to believe that outcomes are purely accidental. And the observers were beginning to sense that what they had witnessed was only the outer layer of a system far larger than anything they could see directly. Removed from constant instruction and daily messaging, the observers found themselves doing something unfamiliar, thinking without immediate framing. Not because belief disappeared, it rarely does, but because routine created space. There were no briefings, no urgent directives, no immediate objective demanding attention. There was only time. And time, when paired with visible evidence, has a way of guiding conclusions that slogans cannot stop. They spoke of the war as men speak of weather once they realize they cannot change it, not with theatrical despair, but with a careful, almost technical clarity. The question shifted from who deserves to win to who can keep going. And in that shift, industrial output emerged as the decisive weapon. It was not shaped like a rifle. It did not roar like artillery. It was measured in tons of steel, in gallons of fuel, in freight schedules, in the regularity of deliveries that kept armies alive. The prisoners had watched those systems operate on American soil with a steadiness that felt beyond disruption. The conclusion did not require emotion. It required only observation. This perspective diminished the glamour of tactical brilliance. Clever maneuvers and exceptional commanders still mattered, but their relevance looked different when the opponent could replace losses endlessly and sustain offensives across multiple fronts. Strategy, in such a world, was increasingly about managing abundance rather than escaping scarcity. Germany's early victories had been built on speed, surprise, and concentration of force. But surprise foders, speed slows. Concentration becomes difficult when the enemy can be strong everywhere at once. Against that kind of depth, even brilliance begins to resemble a temporary advantage. Individual courage, too, felt insufficient. Many of these prisoners had fought with real endurance. Some had watched comrades die with discipline and loyalty. In another war, such courage might have changed the outcome. But here, it seemed to exist inside a larger mechanism that did not pause for heroism. A man can hold a position for a day, for a week, perhaps for a month. But if ammunition cannot arrive, if fuel cannot be delivered, if replacements cannot be trained, then courage becomes a candle in a wind that never stops. The prisoners did not mock bravery, they mourned its limits. In this new conversation, American patience began to appear as a strategic quality rather than a cultural trait. The United States had taken time to commit, time to build, time to train and organize. That delay, once ridiculed as softness, now looked like preparation. America had entered the war not as a nation improvising in panic, but as a nation converting itself into a sustained instrument. Its patience was not passive, it was cumulative. It allowed systems to mature until they could overwhelm. The war's outcome, seen through this lens, appeared sealed, not in the mystical sense of fate, but in the mechanical sense of momentum. Once a production machine reaches full speed, It becomes a kind of gravity. It pulls events toward itself. It rewards endurance and punishes fragility. Germany, already strained by resource limits and bombing, was fighting not only armies but calendars. Every month that passed gave the Allies more material to spend. Every month that passed gave Germany less. And so resistance began to change shape. In the camp, it was no longer expressed primarily as defiance. It became a quieter, heavier thing: acceptance. Not acceptance of captivity as comfort, not acceptance of defeat as justice, but acceptance of defeat as explanation. The prisoners did not need guns to understand what was happening. They needed only to look outward at the rails, the factories, the unbroken routine, and then inward at the beliefs that had promised them a different ending. Because once defeat can be explained without guns, the mind begins to ask the next question. If the outcome was decided by systems and scale, then what, exactly, had all the suffering been for, and who would carry that knowledge back into the world when the war finally ended? As the months passed, the tone of conversation inside the camps changed. It did not change with a single announcement or a single headline. It changed the way voices change when men have carried the same burden too long. The discussions grew somber not because hope vanished entirely, but because the kind of hope that had once been easy to hold could no longer survive contact with what they were seeing. The camp became a place where reality was not argued about in public, but weighed quietly in private. In the early days, faith in German recovery had been sustained by familiar rituals of belief. Talk of new weapons, talk of a coming political fracture among the Allies, talk of a decisive counterstroke that would restore the situation. These phrases had functioned like prayers repeated not because they were proven, but because repetition itself made the mind feel less exposed. Over time, those prayers began to lose their power, not through humiliation, but through accumulation. Every new report of Allied advances, every new convoy rolling past, every new glimpse of uninterrupted production weakened the language that had once protected them. The United States, in particular, was no longer dismissed. That shift carried a strange discomfort, because dismissal had been a form of emotional defense. To mock America was to keep it small, to keep it simple, to keep it predictable. But mockery requires distance, and captivity had erased distance. The prisoners had lived within the American interior long enough to understand that this country did not function like the caricature they had been fed. Its informality did not prevent coordination. Its diversity did not prevent mobilization. Its apparent softness did not prevent endurance. The story they had carried across the ocean was collapsing, and with it a portion of their certainty. What replaced resentment was not affection and not forgiveness. It was respect, reluctant, uncelebrated, but increasingly difficult to avoid. Respect for a society that could organize itself at scale without visible panic. Respect for a system that could sustain war abroad while maintaining stability at home. Respect, too, for the unsettling fact that America's strength did not seem to depend on a single leader or a single ideology. It depended on processes that continued regardless of who was speaking at a podium. In these discussions, the enemy began to be redefined, not as a people, not even as an army, but as a system of rail schedules, standardized parts, supply depots, training programs, and production lines that could absorb loss and return stronger. This was a profound shift, because it meant the war was no longer imagined as a duel between soldiers. It was imagined as a competition between structures of society. A soldier can defeat another soldier, but how does one defeat a system that renews itself daily? That understanding altered the war's meaning. The prisoners began to speak less about tactical moments and more about inevitabilities. They looked back on Germany's early victories with a new lens, still proud, perhaps, but now aware that speed had been mistaken for permanence. A campaign could be brilliant and still be strategically incomplete. A victory could be real and still not be sufficient. In the long war, the prisoners were realizing success belonged to the side that could make success repeatable. And so the laughter at America disappeared. Not because the prisoners had become sentimental, but because laughter had been based on assumptions, and assumptions had been dismantled by evidence. In its place, there was a quieter atmosphere, men learning, in real time, that contempt is a poor substitute for understanding, and that the enemy they had been taught to ridicule had been building something vast, while they were busy believing it could not. Because once mockery dies, the mind becomes vulnerable to a harder thought. If America was never what they were told it was, then what else had been false? And what truth would remain when the camp gates finally opened? From inside the camps, far from the smoke of the front, defeat began to look less like a sudden collapse and more like a long imbalance, finally reaching its conclusion. German prisoners traced it the way a mechanic traces a failure following the line back to the part that could not hold. Not simply mistakes in command, not simply lost battles, but a material disparity that had been present all along and had only grown more decisive with time. Germany could fight fiercely, invent brilliantly, and maneuver with skill, but it could not manufacture the future as quickly as its enemies could. Industrial war has its own morality, and it is a cold one. It rewards endurance over genius. It does not abolish intelligence or courage, but it puts a ceiling on what they can accomplish. A brilliant plan still needs fuel. A daring defense still needs ammunition. A superior aircraft still needs replacements, trained crews, spare engines, and factories that can keep producing while bombs fall. In the first months and years, genius can feel like destiny. In the later years, endurance becomes the real currency, and endurance is often purchased not with bravery, but with infrastructure. This is where human skill meets its limit. German engineering culture, with its respect for the craftsman and the specialist, had produced weapons of real sophistication. But sophistication can become heavy. Complexity increases maintenance, training time, and dependence on rare materials. And when scale enters the equation, even excellent machines can be overwhelmed by sheer volume. The prisoners began to grasp that the battlefield had become less a contest of better versus worse, and more a contest of enough versus not enough. Enough fuel to keep moving, enough trucks to keep supply lines alive, enough aircraft to return tomorrow after losses today. The cost of this logic is not only strategic, it is human. Nations in industrial war begin to resemble factories measured, scheduled, optimized. The language of war shifts from honor and conquest to output and capacity. Leaders speak in tonnage. Planners speak in rates of replacement. The calendar becomes a weapon, and within that machine, soldiers become components. They are trained, deployed, expended, and replaced. Not because anyone enjoys this cruelty, but because the system demands continuity. A broken line means defeat, and so the line must keep moving. For prisoners who had once believed war was shaped primarily by will and discipline, this was a disturbing re-education. They were not excusing the choices that had brought them into uniform, nor were they absolving the regime that had promised them glory. They were recognizing something else, the impersonal logic that had swallowed all personal intention. A man could be brave and still be irrelevant to the overall equation. A unit could fight flawlessly and still be forced back because the enemy's supply trains did not stop coming. In that sense, the camp became a place where the war could be seen as a mechanism rather than a legend. The prisoners watched America's steadiness and understood that victory was being constructed daily, not only in battles but in schedules and repetition. The war, from this vantage, looked less like a series of turning points and more like a gradual tilt history leaning toward the side with deeper systems, broader reserves, and the ability to learn through mass production. That is the cost of industrial war. It turns the fate of nations into a contest of organized capacity, and the fate of individuals into a statistic within it. It does not remove morality from history, but it often hides morality behind process, making suffering feel like an output of the machine rather than a choice made by humans. And as the prisoners sat with this understanding, another consequence emerged. If history had tilted towards systems in this war, then the world after the war would be shaped by those same systems long after the last shots faded into silence. What these prisoners encountered in the American interior was not simply a different country, it was a different form of warfare made visible. The battlefields of the Second World War were filled with tanks, aircraft, and artillery, but behind those instruments stood something more decisive: industrial power. In the modern age, war is not only the clash of armies, it is the clash of capacities, the ability to transform raw material into usable force, to move that force across distance, and to replace it faster than the enemy can destroy it. The prisoners had expected captivity to teach them humiliation. Instead, it taught them scale. America demonstrated that industrial power defines modern conflict not as a metaphor, but as a literal condition. The rail yards, the factories, the supply depots, the standardized parts, these were not background details. They were the foundation. A fighter pilot's courage depends on fuel. Fuel depends on refining and transport. Transport depends on rail and road. Rail depends on steel. Steel depends on mines, mills, labor, and electricity. Modern war is a chain, and the side that can keep every link intact can fight longer, farther, and with greater resilience. This was the lesson the prisoners had absorbed without being taught. They had simply watched the chain function. It also revealed something many of them had not believed possible, that a democracy could mobilize without central coercion in the way dictatorships imagined they alone could. The United States did not require uniformity of thought to produce uniformity of output. It required coordination contracts, standards, training, incentives, and the steady pressure of a shared emergency. American society, noisy and plural, found ways to move in the same direction without marching in step. That did not make it morally superior in every respect, and it did not erase its own tensions. But it complicated a core propaganda claim that only authoritarian discipline could produce national strength. The prisoners could see, in the unbroken schedules and the vast labor force, that persuasion and participation could also generate momentum. Over time, the prisoners began to understand that logistics outlast ideology. Ideologies burn brightly, and they can drive men to astonishing acts of courage, of cruelty, of sacrifice. But logistics endures precisely because it is less emotional. It is a system of repetition, planning, and replacement. It does not require constant belief to function. A rail schedule does not care what a worker thinks. A production line continues whether men feel inspired or exhausted. In a long war, this matters. Ideology can ignite a conflict. Logistics decides whether it can be sustained. The war also suggested a shift in what victory meant. In earlier ages, conquest had been a primary measure. Territory seized, cities taken, resources captured. But the American example implied something different. Production could replace conquest. If a nation can produce what it needs without expanding its borders, if it can supply distant fronts through shipping and rail, then territorial ambition becomes less strategic necessity and more moral liability. The prisoners watched America build power without marching on neighboring capitals, and they understood that industrial dominance could be achieved through output rather than occupation. In that sense, victory was being manufactured, not in a cynical way, but in a literal one. The outcome of the war was shaped by machine tools, standardized gauges, shipyards, training programs, and a labor force that could scale rapidly. Battles still mattered. Lives were still lost in terrible numbers. But the prisoners could see that the war's direction was being reinforced daily by processes that did not sleep. In the factories, the future was assembled piece by piece and then shipped out into the world. When the war ended and prisoners eventually returned home, they carried this lesson with them whether they wanted to or not. Some would speak of it openly, others would keep it private because it threatened too many cherished beliefs. But the knowledge remained. The enemy they had mocked had not relied on theatrics, it had relied on systems, and those systems had proven more decisive than slogans. The world that emerged after 1945 entered a new era, one in which national strength would be measured increasingly in production, logistics, and technological organization. Power would belong to those who could mobilize entire societies, sustain supply chains, and innovate through iteration. The prisoners had seen the outline of that era from behind fences, watching trains move and lights burn through the night. And perhaps the most unsettling part was this. Once modern conflict is understood as a contest of systems, the question is no longer merely who is right or wrong, but who can build the future faster than the other can stop it. Years later, when some of those prisoners looked back on their arrival in America, the memory did not return as a single scene. It returned as a sensation, like stepping into a room where the air itself feels different. They could recall the salt smell of the docks, the slow pull of the train inland, the first sight of rail yards too large to count. They could recall the factory districts glowing through the night, the steady rhythm of freight, the ordinary calm of guards who seemed to know something the prisoners did not. And the shock, strangely, never fully faded. not because it was theatrical, but because it carried a truth that could not be unlearned. In later retellings, it was tempting to focus on battles on the days when armies collided and histories turned in blood. But the prisoners who had seen America's interior understood another relationship. The factories explained the front lines. The bombers that appeared in Europe in waves were not miracles, they were schedules. The artillery barrages that seemed endless were not simply willpower, they were supply. The tanks that returned after losses were not only engineering, they were replacement capacity. Behind every dramatic headline was a quiet continuity, and that continuity had a home far from the rubble of cities, far from the mud of trenches, in places where the war was expressed as output. What America revealed, and what the prisoners carried with them long after the barbed wire was gone, was that its power lay in repetition, not spectacle. It did not depend on a single wonder weapon arriving to save the day, nor on one decisive gamble. It depended on processes that could be repeated without breaking, standardized parts, layered supply chains, training systems that produced competent workers in large numbers, transportation networks that moved material like blood through an organism. The strength was not in any one dramatic act. It was in the ability to do the ordinary again tomorrow, and again the day after, at scale. That is why the war, in a sense, was decided far from the battlefield. Not in the moral sense, human choices and crimes still mattered, and guilt does not dissolve into economics, but in the mechanical sense. The outcome was shaped in boardrooms, shipyards, steel mills, rail junctions, and assembly lines. It was shaped by whether a nation could convert time into material power faster than the enemy could convert material power into decisive victory. Germany had sought decision through speed and shock, through brilliant concentration, through campaigns designed to end the war, before it became a test of endurance. But endurance arrived anyway, and when it did, the war shifted onto ground Germany was poorly equipped to hold. History records this outcome calmly, because history often prefers clean explanations. It notes production totals, convoy tonnage, aircraft output, fuel availability. It marks the dates of offensives and surrenders. It assigns names to operations and calculates the costs. But behind those neat summaries lies something more intimate. The moment a captive soldier realized that he was living inside the evidence of his side's miscalculation, the camp, for him, was not merely a place of confinement. It was a vantage point from which the logic of modern war became visible. And the lesson was not only about America, it was about the age itself. In the industrial era, wars do not always end because one army is braver or one commander is smarter. They end because one system can sustain loss and still grow stronger, while the other system cannot. They end because scale, once fully mobilized, turns into momentum. A nation that can build faster than its enemy can break will eventually command the future, even if it stumbles, even if it suffers, even if it makes mistakes. The future belongs to the side that can keep producing it. So when those prisoners remembered their first days in America, they did not remember humiliation as much as inevitability. They had expected captivity, hunger, punishment, propaganda, a slow erasure of pride. What they discovered instead was something colder and more difficult to fight, a country whose war effort was not a performance but a machine humming steadily beyond the fences. They had been taught to laugh at America. They stopped laughing when they saw the lights. And in the quiet, relentless rhythm of those factories, they understood a final irony by the time they arrived. The war they thought they were still contesting had already begun to end.